Hey everyone! Tonight we're starting with something the medieval world absolutely excelled at. A deep, almost artistic dedication to quiet paranoia. Before we drift too far into the candlelit halls of the past, take a moment, only if you genuinely enjoy these kinds of stories, to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it lets me keep making these slow, cozy dives into history. And while you're settling in, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing people tuning in from different corners of the world, each of us sharing this quiet little space together. Now, if you haven't already, dim the lights. Maybe flick on a fan for that steady, comforting hum. Let your body sink just a little deeper into wherever you're resting. Because tonight, we're easing into a journey through the strange and shadowed side of the Middle Ages. A world full of rumours, half-truths, hidden alliances and conspiracy theories that somehow, against all odds, turned out to be true. Tonight, let's begin with a conspiracy whispered quietly through monasteries, trade routes, and the winding corridors of early medieval Europe. It was a rumour that clung to stone walls like mist, passed from traveller to traveller with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. People spoke of monks, calm, disciplined, obedient monks, working in secret to copy texts that were never meant to survive. Forbidden writings, banned philosophies, fragile knowledge thought too dangerous or too strange for its time. Most dismissed these stories as paranoia. After all, monasteries were places of order and silence. The idea that anything covert happened behind those walls felt like a stretch. But, as history often does, it reveals its deeper truths slowly. Imagine yourself walking through a monastery courtyard just before dawn. The world is still half asleep. A soft bluish light rests over the stone paths, faint and almost weightless. The air is cool enough to graze your skin like chilled silk. You hear the distant toll of a single bell, not harsh or demanding but low and steady, calling the day into existence. Somewhere nearby, robes brush against one another as monks move from prayer to work, their footsteps measured and unhurried. And in this gentle atmosphere, tucked away behind wooden doors and narrow staircases, lies the heart of the rumour, the scriptorium. Some travellers claim they saw candlelight flickering behind shuttered windows long after the rest of the building went dark. Others spoke of monks emerging in the early hours with ink-stained fingers, their eyes heavy but focused, as though they'd been copying through the night. To many medieval observers, these sights felt like clues, subtle hints that some sort of hidden activity was unfolding. A conspiracy, they thought. A secret effort to preserve something the world was not meant to have. The truth, as it turned out, was far softer, far more human, and far more real. Across Europe, monks in distant regions had quietly formed small, informal networks to copy text considered controversial or at risk of being lost forever. Not because they wanted to rebel, not because they were plotting anything dramatic, but because they believed knowledge, any knowledge, deserved to survive. Their secrecy was not born from ambition, but from a gentle, protective instinct, a desire to shelter what was delicate in a fragile world. Picture one of these hidden rooms for a moment. A narrow chamber lit by only 2 or 3 candles, their glow warm but subdued. A wooden table sits in the centre, slightly uneven, carved with marks from years of work. On its surface lies a sheet of freshly prepared parchment, pale and smooth, carrying the faint scent of lime and wool. A monk leans over the page, hood drawn low, quill tightened gently between his fingers. When he dips the tip into the ink, a tiny sound escapes, soft enough that only someone in deep silence would notice it. Outside the window, insects murmur, and the distant sound of an animal nudges the quiet, but nothing disturbs the steady motion of the monk's hand. This was secrecy without any of the drama we often associate with conspiracies. No hidden symbols carved into walls, no secret meetings in shadowy corners. Just a quiet dedication to preserving ideas. Ideas that the monks believed would one day matter, even if their own time wasn't ready for them. In this way, the scriptorium became both sanctuary and vault, a place where knowledge was protected not by force but by patience. The motivations behind these quiet acts were gentle, almost tender. Some monks feared that political or religious turbulence could lead to the destruction of valuable manuscripts. Others believed that even flawed or challenging ideas deserved to be studied rather than erased. And some simply felt that letting a text disappear was like letting a candle burn out in the middle of a long night. A small, precious light gone forever. So they copied, slowly, carefully, secretly. Over time, historians began to notice unusual similarities among manuscripts produced in different lands. A strange symbol in the margins of a Spanish text appeared again in an English manuscript hundreds of miles away. A certain flourish on a letter in Italy matched a flourish found in France. These marks were not coincidences. They were the fingerprints of a network, subtle connections between scriptoria that had shared methods, shared knowledge, and possibly even shared goals. A hidden collaboration that medieval rumour had inflated into a conspiracy, but which, in truth, was simply cooperation wrapped in silence. There is something strangely calming about imagining those long nights, when a monk turned a page with a sound so soft it barely existed. The slow rhythm of reading and copying, the gentle hiss of a candle, the quiet patience of someone who knows their work, may never be recognised but does it anyway. If your mind drifts as you picture it, that's perfectly fine. Let the scene unfold at its own pace. Nothing here needs to be rushed or solved. You're simply a quiet observer in a room where time moves differently. When rumours of late-night work began spreading through villages, they grew with every retelling. A merchant might notice a sliver of candlelight through a monastery window and assume something secretive was happening. A traveller might pass by the gate at an unusual hour and hear faint whispers of discussion. In a world where speculation travelled faster than facts, these small moments ballooned into stories. Stories of coded letters, hidden rooms, forbidden meetings. The truth was far more ordinary, yet also more meaningful. The monks weren't plotting, they were preserving. Eventually, centuries later, as scholars compared manuscripts across Europe, the truth emerged, not in a dramatic reveal, but in slow, steady recognition. The pieces fit together, the symbols, the handwriting styles, the shared choices. It became clear that these monks hadn't acted alone, and in their quiet work, they'd saved countless ideas from being lost forever. A medieval conspiracy that turned out to be real, but without any of the sinister intent. Just care, devotion, and the gentle hope that knowledge would endure. So as we step out of the scriptorium and let the candlelight fade into darkness, we move on to another whisper from the medieval world. A rumour about kings, shadows, and hidden stand-ins. A conspiracy that once sounded absurd, but now reveals a truth stranger, softer, and far more fascinating than it first appeared. Our next story drifts away from the quiet halls of monasteries and into the echoing chambers of medieval courts, where rumours often travelled faster than the people who lived inside them. This one began as a whisper about kings, about men whose lives were so entangled in duty and danger that they sometimes needed someone else to stand in their place. A shadow, a double, a figure meant to be seen, but not known. To many it sounded like fantasy, a paranoid idea born from wandering storytellers. But as with many things in the Middle Ages, the truth was less dramatic than the rumour, yet far more interesting. Imagine a royal court at dusk. Torches flicker along stone walls, their flames dancing in warm, wavering patterns. Servants move quietly across the hall, carrying trays or adjusting tapestries. Courtiers speak in low voices, not wanting their conversations to echo too loudly. Every so often, a guard shifts his weight, armour giving off a faint metallic sigh. In the centre of this space, beneath banners heavy with embroidered lions or crosses, stands a young king. Or so everyone thinks. The idea of a king's double might sound theatrical, but political life in the Middle Ages was unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. Roads were unsafe, alliances unstable, and threats, whether real or imagined, were never far away. A ruler could not always travel where he needed to. Sometimes he couldn't risk being seen. Sometimes he simply couldn't be in two places at once, despite expectations that he should. And so, quietly, discreetly, a solution emerged. A trusted stand-in. The rumour began with merchants, who swore that they'd seen the king riding toward one town, while others swore they had seen him addressing a council miles away at the exact same time. Villagers along travel routes described seeing a royal figure who looked almost like the king, but not quite. His movements were too stiff, his voice not familiar, his manner strangely rehearsed. These inconsistencies gave rise to stories of a conspiracy, of powerful people manipulating the image of the king while keeping the real one hidden. Of course, the medieval imagination ran wild. People speculated that the doubles were criminals promised freedom, or monks brought in for their resemblance, or actors trained in secret. Some claimed these stand-ins attended ceremonies on behalf of the king so that the real ruler could stay safe behind palace walls. Others believed the doubles went into dangerous territories as decoys, drawing attention away from the true monarch. These were dramatic stories, told around fires to make long nights feel shorter. But the truth beneath those stories was far calmer. Royal doubles did exist, but not as part of some grand scheme. Instead, they served simple, practical purposes. Some were used in diplomatic processions, where their presence reassured allies that the ruler was committed, even if he was too ill or too occupied to appear in person. Others acted in ceremonial events when a king could not travel due to distance or weather. And yes, in a few known cases decoys were used during periods of unrest, not to deceive the world in a sinister way, but to buy time, to calm tensions, or to create the illusion of stability. Picture one of these doubles preparing for a procession. He stands in a quiet chamber lit by the early afternoon sun. A servant adjusts the cloak on his shoulders, making sure the colours fall just right. The air smells faintly of beeswax and polished wood. Somewhere down the hall, musicians warm up their instruments, their notes drifting softly through the air like thin threads of sound. The double takes a slow breath. He knows the importance of appearing confident, steady, calm. He does not fully inhabit the role of the king, but he carries its weight for a few moments, like someone holding a fragile object they were trusted with. Even in this small moment, nothing feels deceptive. It is simply an arrangement, a quiet understanding that image mattered as much as presence. In a time when travel was slow and illness was common, delegating appearances was sometimes the only way to maintain order. And yet, once this practice reached the ears of common people, who only had fragments of information to piece together, the idea transformed into a conspiracy. If the king wasn't always who he seemed, then what else was being hidden? If doubles existed, what did that say about the real ruler's power, or safety, or intentions? These questions drifted through medieval society, whispered in taverns and market squares. A baker might tell a customer about the time he saw a royal figure pass by whose face seemed unfamiliar. A shepherd might swear that the man he saw riding on the king's horse carried himself differently. Stories multiplied, as they often do, and eventually created an entire mythology around royal doubles, far more dramatic than the truth, but rooted in real practices. Centuries later, historians found documents confirming what rumour had hinted at. Notes from royal advisors mentioning representatives, letters describing ceremonial stand-ins, accounts of diplomatic missions where the king's presence was understood to be symbolic rather than physical. These records showed that medieval courts used doubles not as part of a grand conspiracy, but as a practical tool in a complex world. There is a quiet comfort in imagining the softer truth. No cloak and dagger deception, just the logistics of ruling in a world without fast travel or reliable communication. A world where weather, illness, or simple distance could separate a ruler from his duties. The double became a bridge, a placeholder, a silhouette carrying the shape of authority until the true figure could arrive. As you picture this, let your mind drift to the gentle rhythm of a medieval court at night. The distant murmur of servants finishing their tasks, the fading glow of candles, the long shadows stretching across polished floors. Somewhere, perhaps, the real king sleeps in a distant chamber, while his double completes a ceremony on his behalf. Two lives moving in quiet parallel, woven together for a brief moment by necessity rather than intrigue. So the medieval rumour of kings using doubles turned out to be true, but not in the grand, shadowy way people imagined. Instead, it is a reminder that even in the past, people found creative, subtle solutions to the challenges they faced. Solutions that looked mysterious from the outside, but were perfectly ordinary within the walls where they were made. And as we leave the royal court behind, we move toward another medieval whisper, one that lived among merchants and travellers. A rumour about strange symbols carved into crates and marked on parchment. Symbols that seemed cryptic, coordinated, and suspicious. Many believed they were signs of a secret guild manipulating trade across entire regions, and surprisingly this time, the rumour was closer to the truth than anyone expected. So, let's wander a little deeper into this story. Because once a rumour like this takes root, it rarely stops at a single explanation. In the Middle Ages, people didn't separate natural disasters from the politics of heaven and earth. If the leaves looked strange, if the river tasted bitter, if someone's livestock behaved oddly, even if the weather shifted in a way that felt unfamiliar, people assumed intention. Someone must have caused it. And as the seasons passed, people began noticing patterns. A village upstream would mention that their bread tasted normal, while another village downstream complained of grain that seemed to lose its colour faster than usual. Some farmers said their sheep avoided certain watering troughs as if they sensed something their owners couldn't. And though these details were small and scattered, they added just enough tension to keep everyone uneasy. Priests began murmuring that the earth itself felt troubled. Millers whispered that the flour had grown heavier, even when ground from the same sacks of wheat. And travellers, those who wandered between settlements and carried stories like seeds, reported that multiple towns across the region had become suspicious at the exact same time, despite having no contact with one another. That didn't happen often in the medieval world. When it did, people noticed. The strangest part was that nothing catastrophic happened right away. There were no immediate deaths, no sudden illnesses sweeping across the countryside, no armies of rats or plagues or sicknesses. Instead, it was like the land itself had developed a faint, persistent ache. Quiet, but present. Familiar, but not quite natural. And soon, talk began shifting from "there is something wrong" to "someone is making this happen." Some suspected rival kingdoms, Others blamed wandering healers and herbalists. A few even pointed fingers at merchants from distant lands, claiming they had brought back substances never seen before. But there was one group, rare, secretive, and unsettlingly quiet, who drew the most suspicion. The small band of men who spent their lives studying the flow of water, minerals, and underground springs. In most villages they were respected. In others, feared. People didn't trust those who understood the hidden layers of the earth. And somewhere, in a dusty corner of an abbey, a scribe wrote that he had seen something days before the first reports. He claimed he had spotted two shadowy figures working near the central well long after the village had gone to sleep. They carried small jars. They whispered to each other. They left before dawn. At the time, the scribe dismissed the incident completely. Only weeks later, when rumours of the poisoned wells began spreading, did he finally confess what he had seen. And suddenly, everything changed. Villagers stopped drinking from the public wells entirely. Buckets were lowered in silence, only to be raised and immediately dumped onto the ground. Families boiled every drop of water they used. Entire markets shifted because laundresses refused to wash linens in communal basins. And the more precautions people took, the more frightened they became. Because fear doesn't fade when you try to avoid it. It deepens, and the medieval world, already fragile, already shaped by superstition, was about to learn that some fears weren't just stories used to keep people awake at night. Some fears had roots, evidence, and eventually, confessions. The moment the first confession surfaced, everything slowed down, almost as if the entire region exhaled and held its breath at the same time. But this confession wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come from a captured spy or a frightened traveller. It came from someone far more ordinary, a young apprentice who worked in the outskirts of a monastery. He wasn't important. He wasn't known. He was simply someone who had been in the wrong place at the right moment, or the right place at the wrong moment. According to the account preserved later by the monks, the apprentice approached his superior with trembling hands, asking to speak privately. He explained that, weeks before the rumours began, he had been assigned to carry supplies from the monastery cellar, herbs, oils, minerals, the usual items used for medicine and ink making. But on one particular night, he noticed something that didn't feel normal. Two senior monks, both respected for their knowledge of healing and natural sciences, were quietly preparing small doses of strange powders. Not herbs, not spices, not anything he recognised from the apothecary shelves. He described the powder as pale and glimmering faintly in the torchlight. He said it looked like crushed pottery, or fine ash, or something that had been ground down far beyond anything used in daily life. When he asked what the mixture was for, he received no answer. One of the monks simply gave him a look, a calm, steady, unsettling look that made him feel as though he had crossed into a room he wasn't meant to see. He dropped the subject immediately, but he didn't forget it. Days later, he accidentally overheard the same men discussing nearby villages. They spoke softly, but he caught a few words. Not dangerous words, not aggressive ones, just clinical. They talked about distribution. They talked about timing. And most hauntingly, they mentioned observing reactions. Even then, the apprentice had no idea what any of it meant. He assumed it was about medicine or studying soil or preparing dyes. But as rumours spread about the wells, about the taste of the water, about the illnesses that weren't quite illnesses, fear began to settle inside him like a stone. And now, unable to keep the burden any longer, he shared what he knew. The monastery reacted instantly. Quiet investigations began. Storerooms were searched. Barrels were opened. Hidden ledgers were discovered. Filled not with scripture or farm accounts, but with careful notes about minerals, water sources and experiments taken from ancient texts. The monks who had prepared the powders disappeared before anyone could question them. Their chambers were left immaculate, their writings gone, their tools missing. It was as if they had stepped out of existence in the middle of the night, and suddenly, the conspiracy no longer felt like a rumour. It felt organised, planned, methodical, which, in the medieval world, was far more terrifying than any plague or superstition, because plagues struck without intention, but people could choose, and the idea that someone had chosen to tamper with the wells, those sacred life-giving veins of the village, was enough to send a quiet shiver through every settlement for miles. Fear had finally found its shape. When fear finally took shape, it did so gently, almost politely. Not with riots or shouting, but with a quiet shifting of behaviour. People began drawing water only at dawn when the light felt safest. They brought candles with them, as if illumination could protect the wells from whatever invisible threat might be settling inside. And in the monasteries, the tone became hushed and watchful. Brothers who once greeted each other warmly now moved with a reserved stillness, as though every footstep might reveal another secret. The investigation continued in ways that only the medieval world could manage. Slowly, cautiously, with a deep respect for the possibility that everything they feared might be true. One of the first meaningful clues came from an unexpected place. A set of abandoned notebooks found behind a storage chest in the apothecary room. They were small, bound in dark leather, and filled with perfectly neat handwriting. Whoever wrote them was meticulous, almost obsessively so. The pages described experiments that stretched back months, maybe longer. They referenced minerals drawn from riverbeds, powders created from crushed stones, and the careful dissolution of those powders into tiny vials. Each entry focused not on harm, but on observation. The notes described how these substances behaved in water, how quickly they dissolved, how long it took for the flavour to disappear. There were diagrams, simple, clean, almost beautiful in their precision. Drawings of wells, drawings of buckets, drawings of tiny scoops that could slip into the water unnoticed. But the most unsettling part wasn't the diagrams, it was the language. The writer never mentioned harming anyone, never mentioned illness, never mentioned intent. Instead, each entry described something else entirely, a theory, a belief, a desire to understand how minerals travelled through an ecosystem. It was scientific curiosity, mixed with absolute medieval disregard for safety, a harmless experiment in their minds, a conspiracy in everyone else's. The monks studying the notes realised something important. The powders weren't poison, they weren't toxic. They were more likely attempts at understanding the movement of trace materials through natural springs, something centuries ahead of its time. But to the villagers, who depended on those wells for every drop of water, even a harmless experiment felt like an attack. It's difficult to explain the medieval mindset from our modern viewpoint. For them, a well wasn't just a utility, it was a lifeline, a sacred, fragile gift. Anything that touched it, whether intentional or accidental, became immediately suspect. So the notes were enough to confirm the villagers' worst fears, even though the reality was more nuanced. And yet, the mystery didn't end there. Because shortly after the notebooks were discovered, another piece of evidence surfaced, this time from a nearby priory. A merchant passing through the region claimed that 2 monks had boarded a wagon at dawn days earlier, carrying crates filled with small glass bottles. They paid in coins so pure and so precisely weighed that it stood out from the usual monastery exchanges. He remembered them because their eyes looked tired, not frightened, not guilty, simply exhausted, as if their experiment had demanded more from them than they ever expected. And then they were gone. No one knew where they went. No one ever found them. They disappeared into the endless stretch of medieval roads, swallowed by forests and rivers and distant towns. But their work remained, and the conspiracy that had once been a whisper had become something real. Evidence, confessions, notebooks, sightings. The truth, when it finally emerged, landed softly. Yes, the wells had been tampered with. Yes, it had been done intentionally. But no, it wasn't meant to harm. It was meant to understand. Still, in the world of the Middle Ages, intent didn't matter. Only fear did. And fear, once awakened, never fully goes back to sleep. Let's drift now, away from the quiet tension of the tampered wells, and into another corner of the medieval world. Someplace colder, more remote, a place where secrets didn't travel through water, but through silence. For this next story, imagine yourself walking along a narrow, windswept coast. The air is crisp, carrying the faint smell of salt and smoke. The sky feels larger here, stretching endlessly over a landscape that seems almost untouched by time. And scattered across this lonely shoreline stand a series of stone buildings, low, sturdy, weathered by centuries of wind. These were the outpost of medieval lighthouse keepers, quiet, overlooked figures who lived at the edges of kingdoms, guiding ships with nothing more than firelight and long, patient nights. And it is here, along these hidden reaches of northern Europe, that one of the strangest medieval conspiracy theories began. A rumour whispered from ship to ship, from tavern to tavern. A rumour that, at first, people dismissed as nothing more than sailors' superstition. They said the lighthouse keepers were signalling enemy fleets. At the time, it sounded absurd. Lighthouse keepers were isolated, poor, and deeply respected for their work. They were the guardians of the coastline, the watchers of the sea. Without them, countless vessels would have vanished into the darkness or shattered on unseen rocks. But the rumour persisted, slowly, quietly, as rumours tend to do. It began with odd patterns noticed by captains who sailed the northern trade routes. Ships belonging to coastal towns were being intercepted far more often than before, specifically near regions where lighthouses stood. Pirate vessels seemed to appear with uncanny precision, as though they knew exactly when a wealthy merchant ship would be passing by. At first, it was chalked up to coincidence, bad luck, misfortune. But sailors are observant by nature, they have to be. And one recurring detail eventually caught their attention. On the nights when ships went missing, the lighthouse flames seemed different. Not brighter, not dimmer, just off. Some captains described the flames flickering in unusual intervals, almost rhythmic. Others said the fire burned with hints of unusual colour. A few even claimed they saw the lighthouse go dark for long stretches, only to blaze back to life moments before disaster struck. And slowly, a theory formed, one stitched together from fear, suspicion, and a strange kind of logic. What if the lighthouse keepers were sending signals, not to the ships they were meant to protect, but to the ships lying in wait? The idea spread quietly. No one wanted to believe it, but no one could quite dismiss it either. And then, one early winter morning, a merchant vessel limped into port bearing the final piece of evidence. The captain reported seeing a lighthouse fire go out, then blaze again in rapid bursts. 3 short flashes, a pause, then one long, steady beam. To most, it meant nothing. But to sailors familiar with the old signalling codes used by rival kingdoms, the pattern was unmistakable. It meant simply, now. That was all it took for the rumour to ignite into something more dangerous, something impossible to ignore. Ports began asking questions, lords demanded explanations, And suddenly the quiet, humble lighthouse keepers found themselves at the centre of a conspiracy that seemed too calculated, too deliberate to be coincidence. But the truth, as always, was more complicated and far more human. And as we move deeper into the story, you'll see how the conspiracy that once sounded impossible slowly revealed itself to be real. The investigation began quietly, because quiet investigations were the only kind possible in the medieval world. There were no forensic teams, no coded telegraphs, no organised networks of communication. There were just people watching other people and hoping they noticed something true. So the first step was simple. They sent observers, not knights, not soldiers. Just ordinary men from the nearby ports. Fishermen, scribes, merchants, people who could approach a lighthouse without raising suspicion. They were instructed to stay for a night or two, to offer food or trade, and to observe the keepers as naturally as possible. And the earliest reports were, somehow, the most unsettling, because every observer wrote the exact same thing. The lighthouse keepers were calm, polite, soft-spoken, tired, just tired. They tended the fires with slow, practiced movements. They welcomed visitors with the easy warmth of someone who hadn't spoken to another living soul in weeks. They cooked simple meals, often sharing more food than they kept for themselves. There was no sign of secret meetings, no coded conversations, no suspicious activity. If anything, they seemed more isolated than anyone had expected. But the reports didn't stop the rumours, they didn't even slow them down. Because while the observers saw nothing unusual up close, the patterns at sea continued. More ships vanished, more captains reported strange flame patterns, more sailors insisted they saw signals that couldn't be anything else. And then came the winter storm. It arrived with no warning, thick, brutal, and fast. Wind slammed against the coastline like a living thing, and waves rose so high they swallowed entire stretches of the shore. Most ships retreated to harbour, anchoring deep in the protected curve of the bay, but one vessel didn't. A merchant ship, heavy with cargo, caught the storm head-on. Unable to turn back, it drifted dangerously close to the rocks, straight toward the lighthouse that had been at the centre of all the rumours. Observers stationed on the cliffs braced themselves, expecting to see the lighthouse fire blaze brighter, guiding the ship to safety. But instead they witnessed something else entirely. The lighthouse went dark. Just dark. For a full minute, nothing. No flame, no glow, only darkness and the thunder of the storm. When the fire returned, it didn't return normally. It flared brightly, then dimmed. Bright again, then dim. Bright, dim, bright. Like the beats of a silent drum. The observers exchanged panicked glances. The pattern matched the rumours. It matched the captain's report from weeks earlier. It matched the fear that had been growing in quiet corners of every port town. And then, almost on cue, the watchers saw lanterns appear offshore. Small, sharp flickers of light, too deliberate to be waves, too steady to be chance. Ships, 2 of them, moving through the storm with strange precision, as if they were following instructions. The observers raced toward the lighthouse, pushing through wind and rain, shouting to be heard. And when they reached the tower, they found the keeper standing alone at the top, his face illuminated by the trembling flame. He wasn't frightened, he wasn't evasive, he wasn't doing anything suspicious. He simply looked exhausted, in a way that settled uncomfortably in the stomachs of everyone present. When they demanded to know why the flame had gone dark, the keeper gave a confused answer, one that made no sense at the time. He said the fire kept collapsing on itself. He said the wood was too damp. He said the wind had pulled the flame apart. He said he had been fighting it for hours. His explanation should have calmed them. But outside, the pattern of the flame still flickered unnervingly, and offshore the ships continued to drift closer. For the observers, it was enough. They seized the lighthouse keeper, dragging him away from the fire, convinced they had caught him in the act. Convinced the conspiracy was real. But as with most things in the medieval world, what they saw wasn't the whole truth. What happened next unfolded not like the dramatic reveal people expected, but like a quiet unravelling, a soft loosening of threads that had been pulled too tightly for too long. After the lighthouse keeper was seized, the observers dragged him down the stone steps and out into the storm, their lanterns trembling in the wind. They demanded answers, speaking over each other, insisting he explain the strange patterns of the flame, the darkness, the sudden bursts of light, the ships offshore. And through all of it he simply shook his head, soaked by the rain, looking more bewildered than frightened. Later people would say that this was the moment everything began to make sense. Not because the keeper confessed anything, but because he didn't. He couldn't. His confusion wasn't the confusion of a guilty man, just the tired bewilderment of someone who'd been awake far too long. When the storm finally eased, the observers began a more careful search of the lighthouse tower. They expected to find hidden tools, coded notes, or secret lanterns tucked beneath floorboards. Instead, they found something disappointingly ordinary. Water. Everywhere. The storage barrels were damp, the wood was swollen, the oil-soaked rags had been ruined. Wind had pushed rainwater through tiny cracks in the walls, soaking everything the keeper relied on to maintain the flame. A steady fire was nearly impossible under those conditions. The damp wood produced a weak, sputtering light. The wick struggled to stay lit. The flame collapsed into darkness again and again, only to flare up once more as air gusted through the cracks. It wasn't a signal. It was just the behaviour of a flame fighting the weather. And the rhythm the observers had seen, the one that frightened them most, was nothing more than the natural stutter of a fire that refused to die. But that alone didn't explain the real mystery, the ships offshore. They waited for dawn, standing on the cliffs until the storm clouds finally broke open into a pale, washed-out sky. And as the light grew, the truth revealed itself with quiet, almost embarrassing clarity. The two enemy ships drifting offshore weren't ships at all. They were pieces of broken mast and hull from a wreck that had happened earlier that night. Debris bobbing in the waves, catching lantern light in ways that made the observers think of distant vessels. In the chaos of the storm, the illusion had been complete. The rumour had fed the fear. The fear had shaped the interpretation, and the interpretation had become a conspiracy. Still, one question remained. If the lighthouse keeper wasn't signalling pirates, then why had so many ships been intercepted over the past months? Why did it seem as if someone was revealing trade routes, schedules, and precious cargo? That answer came slowly. A few weeks after the storm, a merchant confessed under pressure that he had been bribed by pirates to share information about departure times. It had nothing to do with the lighthouses, nothing to do with signals, nothing to do with coastal conspiracies. The danger had come from the ports, not the towers. But the conspiracy, strangely enough, had been real, just misdirected. Someone was providing information to raiders, just not who the rumours claimed. And for the lighthouse keepers, the truth was both a relief and a sorrow. Their names were cleared, but the stain of suspicion never fully washed away. In the medieval world, trust once broken was nearly impossible to restore. And so, slowly, the fear faded. The rumours quieted. The keepers returned to their lonely routines, tending flames that flickered not with coded signals, but simply with the fragile persistence of fire itself. When the truth finally settled over the coastline, it did so gently, like a fog lifting in the early hours of morning. No trumpets, no proclamations, just a quiet, collective understanding that the darkness that had frightened them wasn't the darkness they thought it was. In the weeks that followed the storm, the observers returned to their towns and told the story of what they had seen. Some spoke with relief, others with lingering embarrassment, but all of them carried the same message. The lighthouse keepers were innocent. Still, rumours have a strange momentum. They never stop suddenly. They drift, they thin out, they echo through taverns and marketplaces long after the truth has been revealed. So even as the conspiracy died, the outline of it lingered faintly, like the memory of a dream that dissolves as you wake. The lighthouse keepers returned to their quiet routines. They chopped wood, they dried herbs in the sun, they patched the cracks in the stone walls where the storm had forced its way in. And at night, they tended the flames with even greater care, knowing how easily a trembling light could be misunderstood. Visitors became rare again. The port stopped sending observers, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the coastline returned to the way it had always been. Lonely, patient, indifferent to the concerns of the world beyond its waves. But something had changed in the minds of the sailors who passed through. They began to watch the sea differently. Not fearfully, but thoughtfully. They understood now that the things we fear most are often shaped by the stories we tell ourselves, and the gaps we fill in when we don't have enough answers. And high in the lighthouse towers, the keepers learned a quieter truth. They discovered that the line between suspicion and reality is thin, so thin that sometimes it takes nothing more than a gust of wind, a bit of damp wood, and a single flickering flame to blur it completely. For the rest of that winter, the coastline remained peaceful. Shipwrecks were few, pirates stayed distant, and when the flames of the lighthouse flickered, because all flames flicker, the sailors simply nodded, knowing it wasn't a signal, just the ordinary breath of fire. Eventually spring returned, the sea softened, the storms loosened their grip, and the conspiracy that had once consumed whole towns faded into a curious story. Something to be told slowly beside a hearth, with a cup of warm drink in hand, long after the truth had been settled. A reminder that even in the medieval world, not every shadow was cast by an enemy. Sometimes it was just the light moving, doing what light has always done. For our next story, let's drift inland, away from the windswept cliffs, away from the restless sea, and into the sheltered heart of the medieval world. A place where secrets weren't carried by storms or flickering flames, but by ink. Imagine a long, quiet road stretching through the countryside. The air feels still here, warmer, as if the land itself is holding its breath. And somewhere along this road stands a monastery. Tall stone walls, narrow windows, and long corridors scented with parchment and beeswax. This was a scriptorium, a place where books were copied with meticulous devotion, stroke by patient stroke. On the surface, the monks who worked there lived simple, predictable lives. They rose before dawn, they prayed. They copied manuscripts in silence hour after hour, in the soft glow of sun filtering through small panes of glass. Their world moved slowly, like the turning of a page. But beneath that calm exterior, a quiet conspiracy was growing. One so subtle and so unlikely that for centuries people thought it was a myth. The rumour went like this. Some monks were altering official documents, not rewriting them completely, not forging them entirely, just nudging them, shifting a phrase here, adjusting a line there, changing the placement of a boundary, softening a sentence, adding a single word. Small changes, almost invisible changes that somehow always seemed to benefit the monastery. At first no one believed it. Why would a monastery of all places risk something so dangerous? And besides, these were holy men who spent their lives in study and service. But over the years, tiny coincidences began to stack up. A neighbouring village suddenly owed more tax. A small patch of land now belonged to the monastery instead of the local lord. A disputed inheritance mysteriously resolved itself in the monk's favour. Nothing dramatic, nothing bold, just quiet adjustments, like the soft redirection of a river. And because the world relied so heavily on the written word, on charters, land grants, and legal manuscripts copied by hand, no one could prove anything. The original documents were long gone, the copies were sacred, and the monks who produced them were trusted completely. So the idea of a conspiracy was dismissed, a silly tale, a paranoid whisper. Until one winter morning, when a young archivist discovered something impossible. He was sorting through a box of old wax tablets, temporary writing surfaces used for drafts and notes, when he found one that had been overlooked. The wax was cracked, the wooden frame worn smooth with age, but the lines etched into it were unmistakable. They were practice phrases, fragments of a legal document, written again and again. The handwriting was precise, measured, familiar, but the phrasing, it didn't match the final document stored in the monastery. It contradicted it. The archivist's heart sank. He compared it with the preserved charter. And there it was, subtle but certain. A single line had been altered. A boundary had been shifted by just a few paces, enough to grant the monastery a small but valuable piece of land. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. The archivist brought the tablet to his superior, expecting outrage. But instead, he was met with a long, heavy silence and a tired sigh, as if this truth had been waiting for decades to be uncovered. The superior didn't deny it. He didn't explain it. He didn't attempt to justify it. He simply said, "Some of the brothers believed they were protecting us, protecting the work, protecting the future." The archivist didn't know how to respond. The conspiracy had been real, but it wasn't rooted in greed or power or malice. It was rooted in fear. Fear of losing land, fear of losing influence, fear of losing the fragile stability that monasteries depended on. And so, small alterations had been made, not enough to attract attention, not enough to shape kingdoms, just enough to keep the monastery safe. The truth spread slowly, in quiet conversations behind closed doors, and once again, in the medieval world, a conspiracy that people had laughed at had been proven true. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful changes are the smallest ones, barely visible, almost unnoticeable, yet carrying a weight far greater than a single stroke of ink should ever hold. And since we're already wandering through the darker corners of medieval life, we might as well look at one more thread, one that started as a rumour whispered from tavern to tavern, and eventually grew into something powerful enough to shake entire kingdoms. It was the belief that Europe's ruling families were secretly connected, not just by marriages or alliances, but by a hidden network of information trading. The idea that nobles were quietly sharing intelligence across borders, long before any official messengers or envoys ever arrived. Most people dismissed it as wild speculation, the sort of thing bored villagers would invent to pass the time, but the truth was far stranger. Letters have survived, tucked inside church walls, sewn into clothing, pressed between the pages of old prayer books, revealing that kings, queens, and dukes kept a discreet, almost invisible communication web between them. If a famine was coming, if a war was brewing, if a rival was planning something unwise, someone always found out early. It wasn't magic. It wasn't divine insight. It was simply a quiet, handwritten network, one that used merchants, monks, travelling musicians, and even wandering pilgrims to quietly carry messages from one court to another. A shadowy postal system centuries before a postal system even existed. To the everyday medieval person, it looked supernatural. To us it looks remarkably organised. But to the rulers of the time, it was simply survival. A secret chain of information that helped them stay one step ahead, all under the surface of everyday life. And just like so many medieval conspiracies, what began as a whisper ended up being completely true. And while rulers quietly traded secrets, another rumour drifted through the medieval world, one that sounded almost ridiculous at first. It claimed that certain castles, usually the oldest, coldest, and most remote, were built with hidden rooms that didn't appear on any plans. Chambers tucked behind walls or beneath staircases, accessible only through a narrow slit or a pressure stone. People called them ghost rooms, or the Lord's second shadow. They were said to be used for spying, overhearing conversations or hiding people who were never meant to be seen. Most dismissed the idea as superstition, just another tall tale shared by servants around a smoky kitchen fire. But archaeologists began confirming it, not just once, but again and again. Secret chambers exactly where the rumours placed them. Listening holes disguised as cracks in the wall. Crawl spaces that echoed with voices from the great hall below. Entire miniature corridors woven into the stonework like veins. These weren't accidents, they were deliberate. Designed centuries before, surveillance was a word. Some were meant to watch enemies, others to observe allies, and a few, perhaps most unsettling, were positioned so that the lord of the castle could spy on his own household, the people who lived under his roof, the ones who served his meals, the ones who trusted him. Imagine that. Every laugh, every argument, every whispered confession drifting through the dark passages behind the walls, listened to by someone you never saw. So another medieval conspiracy proved itself true. The past was listening, even when no one realised it. And from hidden chambers in stone, we drift now to something far quieter. The strange tendency of medieval monks to write warnings in the margins of their manuscripts. For centuries, people believed these little notes were jokes or simple scribbles, odd comments like "don't trust the man with the red boots," or "the one who smiles too much hides a blade." They looked like harmless superstitions, the sort of things bored scribes might write after hours of copying text by candlelight. But researchers eventually realised that many of these marginal warnings weren't random at all. They pointed to real patterns, small pieces of a much larger puzzle. It turned out monks were quietly tracking networks of spies who wandered between monasteries disguised as pilgrims. They noticed the same faces appearing again and again, the same questions being asked in different towns, the same symbols stitched subtly onto cloaks. And since their manuscripts were often the safest place to hide information, far safer than loose letters, they recorded their suspicions between the lines of scripture, where only another trained scribe would notice. The conspiracy sounded wild at first. Monasteries as intelligence hubs, monks as observers, manuscripts as encrypted reports. But then it was confirmed. Some monasteries had entire rooms dedicated to copying coded information, with slits in the walls to monitor travellers passing through. Not elaborate, but effective, quiet, patient. And while kingdoms quarrelled and wars shifted the map, these silent observers watched from the edges of the story, rarely mentioned, rarely suspected, yet shaping events one ink stroke at a time. So yet again, the truth was stranger than the rumour. From the quiet manuscripts of the monasteries, let us drift into a rumour that once sounded almost laughable. The idea that medieval cities kept entire teams of people whose only job was to wander the streets at night and listen. People called them shadow watchers, or the ears of the city. At the time, most assumed they were just night guards or simple patrolmen. A small presence to deter thieves, little more. But the Whispers insisted they had a second purpose, one no one wanted to believe. They weren't patrolling for crime, they were gathering information, moving slowly through narrow alleys, pausing near tavern windows, lingering under balconies where arguments trickled into the night air. They listened, and they remembered. And in the morning they reported everything to officials who kept careful notes on who might be stirring trouble, who owed debts, who complained about taxes, who spoke admiringly of foreign powers. It sounded absurd, like a story invented to scare children into good behaviour. But excavations revealed records, quietly written in cramped, cautious handwriting, documenting these nocturnal listeners. Their routes were mapped, their notes preserved, and some cities even kept small, hidden offices where their reports were collected and sorted by candlelight. Not dramatic, not cruel, just persistent. A subtle form of civic control disguised as routine safety. Imagine walking through your town at night, thinking you were alone, unaware that just beyond the torchlight someone stood listening, committing your words to memory. A conspiracy once mocked, proven real. And as these truths unravel, one by one, the medieval world starts to feel less like a distant age, and more like a dimly lit mirror held up to our own. And from the quiet footsteps of the night listeners, we move into a rumour that travelled even farther. One whispered not in cities or castles, but in the vast countryside, among shepherds, traders and travellers who walk the long, lonely roads between villages. It was said that certain medieval bridges, usually the old stone ones with moss creeping along their arches, were built with a strange purpose, not just to cross rivers, but to mark boundaries of influence, invisible borders, lines of quiet control. At first, this sounded like pure superstition. After all, a bridge is a bridge, a practical thing, a convenience, nothing more. But the rumour insisted that some bridges were placed deliberately, not where the river was easiest to cross, but where officials could watch who entered and who left a region. People noticed how often toll keepers were changed, how the same travellers were questioned more than once, how small notes were passed between posts at dawn, then burned before dusk. These bridges weren't just crossings, they were checkpoints wrapped in stone, early examples of border surveillance disguised as simple infrastructure. Historians doubted this for centuries. There were no dramatic defences, no walls, no towers, just a man with a small booth collecting coins. But then, buried under layers of dirt and roots, they found what no one expected. Tiny rooms concealed inside the bridge supports, accessible only through narrow openings. Inside were remnants of benches, oil lamps, even small shelves for storing scrolls. Quiet observation posts, hidden in plain sight. The conspiracy had been true all along, a soft kind of vigilance, almost invisible, almost forgettable, woven into the landscape itself. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost imagine the sound of the river below, and a solitary figure sitting in the cool darkness of the stone arch, listening to footsteps echo overhead, writing down the movements of the world. And from the hidden posts in stone bridges, we drift back to the towns, where another subtle conspiracy quietly shaped lives. It was whispered that merchants, those travelling traders who carried wool, spices and salt between cities, were often part of intricate agreements that no one outside their circles could see. These weren't just trade deals, they were informal intelligence networks. They shared news about political shifts, grain shortages, tax changes, and rumours of uprisings. At first, townspeople laughed at the idea. Merchants were concerned with profit, not politics. But over time, patterns emerged. Certain towns always seemed prepared for shortages. Certain noble families received news of rivals' plans before anyone else. And those who looked closely discovered that a network of merchant correspondence had quietly existed for decades, if not longer. Letters hidden in bales of cloth, notes tucked inside barrels of salt, symbols stitched into sacks, understood only by those trained to recognize them. A soft, invisible thread connecting people and events across vast distances. And once again, what had begun as a rumour was entirely true. The medieval world in this way reveals itself not as chaotic or ignorant, but as quietly observant, endlessly resourceful. Conspiracies were rarely the work of villains. They were often the result of careful, patient planning. Subtle actions that rippled outward slowly, barely noticed, until someone centuries later would uncover the evidence and marvel at its ingenuity. And as we leave these merchants to their quiet schemes, the lesson becomes clear. The past often whispers to us in gentle, almost invisible ways. The things that feel imagined or impossible sometimes turn out to be quietly, undeniably real. And now, let us wander deeper into the medieval world, to a place where the shadows of courts and kings blend softly with the quiet corridors of power. Imagine yourself standing in a dimly lit hall, the air faintly scented with burning wood and aged parchment. Tall windows let in a pale, diffuse light, and the floor echoes faintly under your steps. You can hear distant voices from beyond the stone walls, messengers, servants, courtiers moving with slow, purposeful grace. Here, in these hushed halls, a rumour once spread. It was almost impossible to believe, yet it persisted. The most powerful nobles were secretly manipulating coinage, not just printing more money or minting new coins, but subtly altering the weight and composition of the metal itself. Tiny changes, imperceptible to the untrained eye, enough to quietly shift wealth from one group to another over years. At first, people laughed at the notion. Kings and dukes concerned with coin manipulation? Surely it was a tale invented by envious merchants or bored scribes. But slowly evidence began to surface. Merchants noticed small discrepancies. A silver coin that weighed just a fraction less than it should. Gold that seemed slightly off in hue. A local lord quietly amassed wealth, while neighbouring lords complained of shortages. Patterns emerged, not mistakes, not accidents, intent. And the more careful observers looked, the clearer it became that the system was deliberate. Not chaotic, not greedy, in the usual sense, but calculated, almost surgical. A silent redistribution of wealth orchestrated from the very top. What made this conspiracy remarkable wasn't its scale. It wasn't even the subtlety. It was the patience. Years of small, careful alterations that barely anyone could detect. A plan so slow, so methodical, that the world itself barely noticed until much later. And yet, centuries later, historians confirmed it. Analysis of surviving coins, mint records, and royal ledgers revealed exactly what the rumours had claimed. The nobles had quietly, patiently manipulated the economy, and in doing so shaped the lives of thousands. In the medieval world, conspiracies rarely shouted. They whispered, they crept, and they waited. And as the whispers of manipulated coinage spread quietly through the towns, another layer of the story began to emerge. It wasn't only the nobles or kings involved. Clergy, advisors, and even some merchants became unwitting participants, carrying messages or transferring funds without fully understanding the purpose. Each step seemed ordinary, mundane, but it served a larger, hidden plan. A plan that would only become visible decades later, when historians began piecing together the surviving evidence. The manipulation was subtle. A coin here weighed just a fraction too little, a ledger entry there slightly altered, and over time the differences compounded. Taxes appeared lighter for some, heavier for others. Markets adjusted in ways that seemed coincidental, but were anything but. Villagers and townspeople noticed small inconveniences, some complaining of suddenly more expensive bread, others noting that merchants from certain regions seemed wealthier than they had any reason to be. But in a world without rapid communication, with no newspapers or modern records, the changes felt isolated, disconnected. No one could see the full picture. No one could track the small, steady current of influence moving quietly beneath the surface. It was a conspiracy of patience, of subtlety, of time itself. And in the process it revealed something about the medieval mindset. Not a mindset of chaos or cruelty, but one of foresight and meticulous planning. Power, they realized, did not need to announce itself with swords or proclamations. It could grow in the quiet shadows, measured in grains of silver, small adjustments to weights, tiny alterations in records. For centuries the rumour was dismissed, too clever to believe, too subtle to prove, and yet eventually the evidence surfaced, confirming what the townspeople had only suspected in passing glances, whispered comments, and the slow accumulation of anomalies. The conspiracy had been real, a quiet truth, hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently for those who could see it to finally understand. And as the quiet manipulation of coinage unfolded, its effects began to ripple outward in ways few could immediately recognize. Some towns grew richer, seemingly by chance. Merchants prospered, able to expand their trade, acquire new goods, and hire more help. In other regions, wealth slowed, stagnated, or disappeared entirely. Families who had relied on stable incomes suddenly found themselves scraping by. No one suspected the cause, not at first. They assumed misfortune, poor harvests, or human error. And in a world where life was already unpredictable, the small shifts often went unnoticed. But for those who paid careful attention, scribes, chroniclers, and observant merchants, the patterns became clear over time. The same nobles always seemed to benefit. Their debts were quietly forgiven, their lands expanded, their influence solidified. The system was almost invisible, but incredibly effective. What makes this conspiracy remarkable isn't just the cleverness of the scheme, but its restraint. The nobles did not seek sudden upheaval or dramatic displays of power. They moved slowly, carefully, like water-eroding stone. The cumulative effect over decades was enormous, but it appeared to the untrained eye as ordinary life continuing uninterrupted. And the impact went beyond money. Communities shifted. Alliances changed. Some disputes were resolved favourably for those who controlled the subtle flow of wealth, while others became silent sources of tension. Over time, these small interventions shaped the political and social landscape of entire regions, without a single sword being drawn. Historians looking back centuries later marvelled at the ingenuity. The conspiracy that had once seemed like rumour was undeniably real, and it had been executed with a patience and subtlety almost unimaginable by modern standards. It's a reminder that in the medieval world, conspiracies weren't always violent, they weren't always dramatic. Some were quiet, hidden in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of daily life, affecting generations before anyone fully realized what had happened. And so, as the decades passed, the subtle manipulation of coinage left its mark not through spectacle, but through quiet transformation. By the time the original nobles were long gone, their careful adjustments had reshaped towns, trade routes, and even the balance of local power. Families had prospered or declined largely because of decisions no one could see, choices so carefully hidden, that only the faintest trace remained in ledgers and surviving coins. And yet, there was no outrage, no public trial, no declaration of villainy. In their minds, the conspirators had acted not out of greed alone, but out of preservation. Preservation of influence, preservation of stability, preservation of their way of life. The truth emerged slowly, centuries later, when historians pieced together old mint records, coin weights, and surviving account books. The rumour, once dismissed as fanciful, proved to be real, and in its quiet revelation, we see a pattern that repeats throughout history. Conspiracies need not shout to be powerful. They need only whisper, subtly and patiently, waiting for time to reveal their effects. And so, as we leave these quiet halls and the muted clinking of coins behind, remember this. The medieval world is not always as it seems. Its conspiracies are often gentle, patient, and hidden in plain sight. Sometimes the most profound changes happen without noise, without drama, quietly, over time. And now, let us drift gently toward our final segment, where we explore one last conspiracy, one so strange and enduring that it continues to fascinate scholars and storytellers alike. And now, let us drift into the last corner of our journey tonight, a corner where suspicion, secrecy, and human curiosity intertwine in ways both quiet and extraordinary. Imagine yourself walking along a narrow, forested path. The trees stretch high above, their leaves rustling softly in a breeze you can barely hear. The ground is damp, the air scented faintly with moss and earth. Somewhere, not far off, a small village sleeps beneath the shadow of an ancient castle. It was here, in these remote villages and small towns, that one of the most peculiar medieval conspiracies began. The belief that certain religious relics, small objects said to carry divine power, were being deliberately manipulated, not stolen, not destroyed, but subtly altered. At first, this sounded absurd. Relics were holy. They were protected by priests, revered by pilgrims. Why would anyone interfere with them in secret? But over time, travellers and pilgrims began reporting strange inconsistencies. A relic would appear to be heavier than it should. Another would be slightly tarnished, or inscribed with symbols that seemed unfamiliar. Some relics vanished for months at a time, only to return to their shrines as if nothing had happened. The rumours spread slowly, whispered from one church to another. Some said it was the work of rival monasteries. Others insisted it was the clergy themselves testing faith or consolidating influence. But no one knew for certain, and the secrecy was so meticulous that it was nearly impossible to prove. And yet, centuries later, scholars discovered evidence that these suspicions were in fact true. Some relics had been altered. Certain shrines had moved pieces of their treasure from one location to another. Monks, abbots, and even local nobles had quietly orchestrated changes to maintain control, encourage pilgrimage, or protect their treasures from theft. It wasn't theft, it wasn't greed, at least not in the dramatic sense. It was careful stewardship, combined with the subtle exercise of power. A conspiracy, yes, but one hidden in plain sight. And as you imagine the flickering candles in those quiet chapels, the soft rustle of robes, and the distant murmur of prayers, you can sense how patient, methodical, and enduring this conspiracy truly was. And as the whispers of altered relics spread quietly through villages and towns, another layer of the story began to emerge. Not all changes were made for control. Some were made out of fear. Fear of theft. Fear of war. Fear that invading forces might seize holy objects and claim them for themselves. So relics were moved, altered, or concealed in ways that would appear ordinary to the casual observer, but completely disguised their true significance. pilgrims sometimes noticed anomalies, an unusual symbol carved into a case, a relic heavier or lighter than remembered, but were dismissed by clergy as mistaken or forgetful. The truth was deliberately kept subtle, and the cleverness lay in the patience. The changes were slow, incremental, almost invisible. A small piece of gold shifted here, a tiny inscription erased there. By the time anyone noticed, decades had passed, and the original context was already fading from memory. Some historians now believe that entire networks of monasteries coordinated these alterations. They shared knowledge in secret using coded letters and subtle markings, passing instructions quietly among trusted clergy. Travellers carried messages disguised as devotional prayers. Pilgrims brought news, often unaware that they were delivering intelligence. It was a conspiracy that thrived on discretion, on patience, on the quiet certainty that small, careful actions repeated over time could influence the faith, the economy, and even the politics of entire regions. And yet for centuries it remained only a rumour, a tale whispered among pilgrims, dismissed by outsiders, forgotten by most. Until centuries later, when careful study of surviving records, relics and letters confirmed that the quiet, deliberate manipulation of sacred objects had indeed taken place. It was not dramatic, it was not violent, it was subtle, patient and meticulous, a true testament to the ingenuity of the medieval mind. And as the relics were moved, altered or subtly changed, the consequences slowly rippled through the medieval world. Pilgrimages shifted. Certain shrines became more prominent, others quietly diminished. The flow of offerings changed, altering the wealth of villages and monasteries alike. Nobles and clergy who once held little influence gained authority simply by guiding the faithful toward the right locations. Yet all of this occurred without fanfare. No battles were fought over the changes, no public disputes erupted. The world continued its rhythm of work, worship, and quiet observation, almost unaware that these small interventions were shaping daily life. Even ordinary villagers, who believed they were simply visiting holy sites, unwittingly participated. Each prayer, each coin offered, each tale told by a pilgrim became part of the silent network, reinforcing the influence of those who had orchestrated the subtle manipulations. And the beauty of this conspiracy, if it can be called that, lies in its patience. Small actions repeated over decades quietly shifted the balance of faith and power. The people involved did not rush. They did not seek immediate recognition. They moved carefully, deliberately, with the long view in mind. When historians eventually pieced the evidence together, they realized that the rumors were entirely true. The movement and alteration of the relics had happened. It had been subtle, nearly invisible, and yet profoundly effective. And so, as you imagine the flickering candlelight in those monasteries, the quiet corridors and the whispered instructions carried through hidden notes and careful gestures, you can sense the medieval world in its full complexity, a place where conspiracies often whispered rather than shouted, and yet changed everything. And so, as centuries passed, the subtle manipulation of relics left its quiet mark on the medieval world. Shrines gained or lost influence, villages prospered or faded, and countless lives were shaped by decisions no one could see. And yet the world moved on. People prayed, worked, and travelled, unaware of the careful orchestration behind the scenes. The conspiracies we've explored tonight, lighthouses and fires, altered manuscripts, silent observation networks, coin manipulation, and hidden relics, share a quiet truth. They remind us that history is rarely loud. It rarely announces itself with trumpet calls or dramatic battles. Often it whispers, slowly, patiently, persistently. And as you let your thoughts drift along these quiet corridors of the past, you may feel a sense of calm, a recognition that even in centuries filled with suspicion, secrecy, and subtle intrigue, life carried on. People lived, people worked, people slept, and somehow, through it all, the world kept turning. So now, as our journey through these medieval conspiracies comes to a close, take a slow, deep breath. Feel the weight of history settle gently around you. Allow the quiet lessons of patience, subtlety, and observation to ease your mind. And as the last flicker of candlelight fades in your imagination, let sleep come softly, carrying with it the whispers of a world that was once mysterious, cautious, and endlessly fascinating. Good night.